Welcome everyone to this lecture on TensorFlow Graphs. So TensorFlow makes heavy use of graphs, and a lot of this actually happens behind your code, basically behind the scenes or under the hood. But let's go ahead and discuss the basic idea behind graphs. Graphs are sets of connected nodes, and sometimes these are called vertices, and the connections themselves between nodes are referred to as edges. So if you have two nodes that are connected, the connection itself is an edge between those two nodes. And in TensorFlow, each node is an operation with possible inputs that can supply some sort of output. And hopefully this feels familiar from our previous section. So in general, with TensorFlow, we're going to construct a graph and then execute it. We're going to start by showing a very simple example in Python, and then we're also going to discuss how TensorFlow uses a default graph. So the very first graph that we're going to create is this one right here. We're essentially just going to have two nodes, each of them a constant. So n1 and n2 are the two nodes, and then respectively, the constant that these two nodes hold are 1 and 2. Then we're going to put them into an operation node, or n3, which is going to be an add operation, and then that will output 3. Let's open the Jupyter Notebook and code this out. Alright, so I've already imported TensorFlow as TF, and let's start by creating our first two nodes, which are just those constants. So say TF constant, we'll have a 1 here, and then n2, that second node, is also going to be a constant, and we'll have that be 2. So then our third node, n3, is just going to be n1 plus n2. And now we've essentially created a graph where we have two nodes, and then the operation node, or n3, is just that adding them together. So then we're going to say with TF session as SESS, go ahead and set the result as ses.run, that third node for us, and then let's go ahead and print that result. And here we have 3. So if I had just asked to print the third node, I would have gotten, hey, tensor. And this add 6 just because I've been calling code before and didn't reset the kernel. But again, here we have the actual result after running it in a session. So I want to briefly talk about default graphs with TensorFlow. When you start TensorFlow, a default graph is created, and you can actually create additional graphs pretty easily. So for example, if I say print tf.get, and then there's going to be a get default graph. It's also a default session, but let's just talk about graphs for now. So if I run this, it says tf get default graph, and it returns back the graph object I currently have operating at this point in memory on my computer. Obviously, you're going to have a different point here when you print this out. So then I can say g is equal to tf.graph, and then if I check out print g, I can see it's grabbing a different graph here that I just created. So now I have my default graph and then this variable g, which is another graph. So if I want to set this new graph as the default, what I can do is the following. I'm going to recreate two graphs again. One is going to be graph 1, which is going to be the current default graph. So I have graph 1 is the current default, whoops, spelled that wrong. Graph 1, there we go, is the current default graph. So if I say print graph 1, that memory does line up with my default graph. So look, it's CC0 at the end. Here we have CC0. So graph 1 is currently my default graph. I'm going to say graph 2 is equal to some new graph. Run that, print graph 2. So now currently I technically have 3 graphs. I have my default graph in graph 1. I have this letter G, which we won't really be using, but that's also a graph. And then I have graph 2 over here. So what would happen if I wanted to set graph 2 as my default graph? Well, what I can do is the following. I can say with graph 2 dot, and then each graph has a as default command. So then I can say with graph 2 as the default, and then I can do something. So let's go ahead and say print, and I'm going to say graph 2. I'm going to use the is operator in Python to say is get default graph. So now that prints out true. So I can say with graph 2 as the default, print graph 2 is default graph. And if I try to print this line outside of this with statement, so I'm just going to copy and paste this, notice that it's going to be false because currently outside of this at a global scale, graph 1 is currently the default graph. But if I ever have multiple graphs and I want to set one of them as the default, I can say with this one as the default. Now, typically for pretty much all our use cases throughout the course, this sort of definition of setting something as a default graph isn't going to be too important for us. It mainly comes into play as far as our notebooks are concerned when we kind of need to reset things and make sure that we're dealing with one graph. As we get multiple variables and multiple graphs, sometimes towards the end of a cell we want to make sure, hey, we have one graph here and it's running one operation, so we'll reset it as the default. But you won't really see this command that often throughout the course. I just want you to be aware of it so that when you do see it, it's not kind of a total mystery. Okay, so that's basically it. Hopefully this first part felt really familiar to you because we've already done it kind of like 3 times. All right, coming up next, we're going to begin discussing variables and placeholders with TensorFlow. I'll see you there.